This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. The Weekly Wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Before we get into the headlines, if you're listening to this episode on your Spotify Weekend Drive playlist, take your phone out, type News Club and hit the follow button. The reason being the playlist is being deprioritised by Spotify, so you won't be able to find us there much longer.
And we know that lots of squizzers have found us via that playlist. So if you follow us, if we do drop out of that playlist, you'll be able to find us because we'll be on your homepage.
That's it for housekeeping. Let's get into the news. Entertainment at the top, Claire. The Logies and the Democratic National Convention, if we can be so bold as to call them both entertainment.
They were certainly entertaining, so I think that's fair enough. A few other stories from the week that include what happened with the NDIS this week. That's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. A focus on crime in Queensland and also that yacht that sank off the Italian coast.
Coming up is the start of the Paralympics and a big meeting in our region. Let's do it. Logies, Claire, did you watch it? I haven't actually asked you yet.
No, we haven't caught up on it.
No, we haven't talked about the Logies.
Things like that. No, I did not.
I did not either, but I saw all the reels and the fashion.
I think you're a bit like me. I kind of rely on that to catch up rather than actually watching the actual thing.
Lots of people did. I mean, Google Trends said to us this week it was the most searched term. Looking at the ratings, it was the most watched free-to-air show this week, a national audience of 1.3 million. Very few shows on those channels get over 1 million viewers these days.
Very few free-to-air shows do that. The broadcast went for 4 hours, so I really do wonder how many people did stay on to the end. It was a Sunday night, so a school night. I mean, you've got to be brave to really lock into a 4-hour show on a Sunday night, I reckon. The biggest winner on the night was Netflix. They had that original series, Boy Swallows Universe, of course, the Trent Dalton book that was turned into that series. It won 5 of the 6 categories that it was nominated in. Have you watched that?
I've read the book and I've watched the first episode, and I actually stopped watching because I wanted to watch it with my husband. I thought it was actually a good show to watch together, and then we just never did.
Got it there,
but I was reminded too, again, of course, this week, the Gold Logie for the most popular personality on TV, Larry Emder, took that out. He thanked his adult-age kids. He confessed they haven't watched free-to-air TV in about 15 years.
It's a really big elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
That younger generations aren't connected to free-to-air television and, of course, our TV industry. They're just as disrupted as all other media and entertainment channels. He did his bit, though, to get people to watch free-to-air TV. The next morning on the morning show on 7, he got an image of a Logie with all the nominees' names and initials tattooed on his bum. Very Australian? I don't know.
I did watch this. This was quite a piece of television, I've got to say. There was facial expressions. There was
live
commentary.
on air.
It was a lot.
Full on.
Moving on to the Democratic National Convention, that was in Chicago. I think we're putting it in the entertainment category because it was really star-studded, of course. Oprah, Stevie Wonder, Mindy Kaling, Kerry Washington, Pink, John Legend. The list goes on and on. Who's on your list?
Oh, Stephen Colbert, Spike Lee, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, the Obamas, although I guess the Obamas are probably more political establishment than celebrity, maybe.
In this
context, yeah. A real demonstration of support that's very American. We don't quite get that kind of celebrity element in our politics here. You and I worked in politics. I remember how rare it was for someone notable outside of politics to actually put their hand up and say that they support a political candidate.
Yeah. Maybe that's just outside of politics.
I kind of remember, I was thinking about it. I remember Kevin Rudd. Remember his convention after he was elected, and Kate Blanchett and Hugh Jackman.
That's right.
They weren't quite campaigning, but it was a bit of a sense that they were lining up with Kevin Rudd. I don't know.
But it is very American, of course. And you look at who is lining up where the Democrats and Kamala Harris have support from people Republicans would call the Hollywood elite. So people who they say don't have much in common with middle America. Donald Trump, as their candidate, on the other hand, has a kind of different celebrity supporter.
Yeah, so we're talking about people like Hulk Hogan, the former pro wrestler, musician Kid Rock, billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk, his support for Trump has been a bit of a news story of late. Very blokey blokes. It's a very masculine kind of scene. Whether any of it matters is very questionable to voters anyway, I reckon.
I guess in a country where it isn't compulsory to vote, the candidates will try anything to get people support, to get them to come out and vote. That's kind of the sideshow of this week's convention. Let's get into, I guess, the substance. Kamala Harris's speech was an important one.
A really important one. She's been vice president, of course, for almost 4 years. She's not a nobody, but she really does have to define herself and what sort of president she's going to be. It's a different conversation to have with voters. And this was really the stage for her to do it on. Reading into the strategy, there's been a bit that's been made about the campaign's positioning of her as this joyful warrior.
She's very smiley.
Very smiley.
Incredibly smiley. And when it's all said and done, I'm sure there will be a million academic studies done on this, what it means about women and leadership in the modern era. At the end of the day, the Democrats are hoping that Americans want relief from Trump's abrasive style. And I should add, it's a call they're making based on millions of dollars spent on polling and focus groups. So it's not quite a stab in the dark.
No, they would have some data behind that for sure. As for what she's campaigning on, it seems to be this real doubling down on middle-class families. She's highlighted her own background, wants to explain how she understands the challenges that are being faced by those sorts of families, middle-class families, and that she shares those values.
When you say challenges, we're talking the economic challenges in a lot of instances.
It's the same conversation as we're having here, things like cost of living pressures, unemployment's on the rise there, things like access to healthcare and education, of course, in America always have their big, big barriers. So, yeah, lots of things that both Trump and Harris are really focusing on.
The other thing to note this week is that the third presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., if you didn't know, there was another presidential candidate that people could vote for in this election. He looks like he's going to pull out of the race. He was polling at about 10% support from voters, but that's halved since President Joe Biden announced that he would not be running.
Yeah, and if you haven't clocked him quite yet, he's a Kennedy from the famous Kennedy family. He's the son of the Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, nephew of President John F. Kennedy. His backstory is really quite interesting. He's an anti-vaxxer, he's an environmental lawyer, he's a conspiracy theorist. He's really in that part of the internet.
According to those who don't believe his conspiracies. I mean, if you believe his conspiracies, then he's not a conspiracy
You're right.
theorist.
I am standing in a very different position. That's exactly right. He's been in the news of late because there's been this story that has sort of bubbled up after years and years of mystery. And that is that he collected a dead baby bear, a small bear, from the side of the road as he was driving into New York for dinner one night. He ran out of time. He dumped the bear in Central Park in Manhattan. So there's been all these stories for years about where did this bear come from? Anyway, he's put his hand up to that. So it's a whole thing.
That is, like, you told me about this and then I read about it going, it can't be that can't be the story, but that's the story. It was 10 years ago and now he's sort of jokingly sort of come out saying, well, that was me.
Yeah, and he's got a freezer full of roadkill.
I don't even know. Like,
he's a character.
That is the story. It's exactly as it sounds. That is the story. Politically, though, what those in the know are saying is his withdrawal would pretty much see his support transfer to the Trump campaign. In a close election, every vote counts. Let's move on. Sticking with politics, but here in Australia politics, there are a few things from our federal parliament this week to wrap up. Possibly the biggest of them are the changes to the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. A bill with some changes was passed on Thursday after states and territories agreed with the federal government on the reforms.
And the main game there is to trim the ballooning costs. There's been quite a bit said over the last few years about how where they started hasn't been where they've landed in terms of the cost. It's really gone into a realm that's surpassed Medicare and surpassed spending on aged care. So the game has been to try and bring those costs down. The reforms will change the way that participants receive a support plan and the money behind that plan. It'll give more powers to the head of the NDIS agency, or I think it's called the NDIA, in charge of the scheme. There will be a list as well that will outline what sort of things can be paid for under the scheme.
The ballooning costs issue is the big criticism of the NDIS. It's too open-ended also, and that it's seen, obviously, the costs blow out. If you're someone with a disability or a carer or an organisation supporting people with disabilities, this might be a disappointment though. What I've seen this week is some saying that changes remove participants' right to choose and control the things that could make a huge difference in their lives. The government says that's not the case. Rather, these steps will help prevent fraud in the system. Claire, the bill's been passed. I mentioned the state and territories agreed to the change. That was quite a breakthrough.
Yeah, it really is. So anyone who has experience with our health system or any system really with the sort of supports that come through government services, there are things that the feds are responsible for and there are things that the states and territories deliver. When it comes to disabilities, when the NDIS was turned on, the states and territories backed off in some areas because it was being covered by this scheme. So it was a part of why the cost blew out. So the NDIS Minister is Bill Shorten. He's demanded that the states and territories improve their offerings, particularly for people with less intense needs.
Kids with autism was the main one that was spoken about this week. To put some numbers to it, more than 8% of 5 to 7-year-olds were able to access the NDIS after being diagnosed with level 2 autism. After looking into it, the government found, though, that level 1 autism in Australia had basically disappeared.
Yeah, so the suggestion there, of course, is that there was some things being done in the back end so kids could get support through there and not elsewhere. So the experts say those less intense needs, though, now go back to the states and territories through their health and their education systems. A lot to work out there. So there's going to be a lot more on that.
Yeah, you and Bryce also talked last week about the very shouty debate in Parliament regarding visas for Gazans fleeing the war. That very much continued this week. I think I heard a report this morning that said every question in Parliament this week from the opposition was about this issue.
They were, on a bender with that one for sure.
Yeah, it's easy though, and what we wanted to point out, we don't want to cover that off again because you did talk about it last week, but I think it's easy to think our politics is all shouting and disagreement. These NDIS changes were done with the major parties working together, as were a few other things this week, thanks to, pointed out by our mate David Spears.
Our mate David Spears. We haven't mentioned our mate David Spears for a little while. And yes, he does a column that usually drops on the ABC website on a Thursday afternoon or a Friday morning. And this week he has gone down that route to establish exactly where the collaboration is in a pretty bruising political week. So on Monday, legislation was passed to clean up the CFMEU. We've talked about that in the past. There was a bill that was passed to crack down on the sharing of deep fake pornography. The major parties also cooperating on a bill to deal with the inappropriate behaviour in parliamentary workplaces.
So there is consultation and like with the NDIS on top of that happening between Labor and the Coalition, also to reform the aged care system. Parliament's now breaking for a couple of weeks before getting back into it in September, but I think it's nice for people to know that sometimes they do work quite well together.
There is work that gets done.
There is work that gets done. Another story to pull out this week is from way up north in Townsville. G'day to anyone listening from up there. I was watching the news this week and I was also scrolling on my phone, as you do.
And cooking dinner and looking after kids probably at the same time.
I don't do a lot of cooking, but, to be fair. But I was like, something piqued my interest and it was because I saw footage of people in Townsville with signs demanding something be done about the levels of crime in the town. I think that might be old footage, but I thought it could be a good issue to resurface because it's going to be a thing.
It's going to be a thing, particularly because there's a Queensland election that's on the 26th of October. So that's not far away. This issue of crime, in particular youth crime, it's ongoing. It just keeps on keeping on. Yesterday, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, the coalition leader, as well as Stephen Miles, the Queensland Premier, and David Crisafulli, who's the opposition leader, the LNP leader in Queensland, they attended News Corp's annual Bush Summit in Townsville. They used that platform to speak directly about solutions to those sorts of issues for people in that region.
And if you're wondering what those solutions are, as it stands, the Queensland government under Stephen Miles has provided more resources to try and combat crime. Earlier in the year, he said he'd remove detention as a last resort. The opposition, led by David Crisafulli, wants longer sentences. His quote, "Adult crime, adult time."
And Kate, I reckon coming back to the conversation you had with Bernie
Shakeshaft.
Exactly.
Bernie Shakeshaft, of course. Yeah.
So questions about troubled youth He's very anti-detention.
Yeah, so I spoke with him. I did an interview with him months ago now, as part of like on News Club. You can listen to it, and I'm sure many people have. He has dedicated his life to helping, troubled youth. I guess he is very anti-detention because he says once they get locked up, the chance of rehabilitation is significantly diminished. The numbers do actually support that view. This ABC report I saw said 286 youth have been detained in the period 12 months to April. 257 of those reoffended within 12 months of being released.
Yeah, and meanwhile, you've got Bob Katter, who is one of the local MPs up there, federal MPs. He reckons that relocation sentencing is the way to go. That is, sent to a remote property, they would work, they would learn a different way of life, they'd get out of their community and the trouble that is potentially sparking those sorts of crimes, become better members of society.
That's his words. That's his words. I mean, I think at the nub of it, what we're saying is that there are a lot of people trying to find ways to solve this problem, but it is a really tough one. Let's talk about this ship off the Italian coast.
This is one, Kate, that you said to me you saw a bit about, but needed some talking points on.
It's a barbecue stopper.
It is a barbecue stopper because there's just so many strings to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, there'll be a movie made about it.
If you
didn't know the backstory, it'd be like, that couldn't possibly be true.
It's really wacky. So there were 12 passengers and 10 crew members aboard the yacht. 15 survived, 6 have died. Mike Lynch, Mr. Lynch's 18-year-old daughter Hannah, Jonathan Bloomer, who's chairman of global financial services company Morgan Stanley International, Chris Morvillo, a lawyer at the British multinational law firm Clifford Chance, and 2 others we don't know the names of yet. Claire, Mike Lynch, though, is a very big name.
A very, very big name, and he's been called the king of technology, basically Britain's Bill Gates. It's that kind of scale in terms of the UK. He created Autonomy. It's a search engine that could go over emails. It analyses data, other internal business documents. It helps companies to find information more quickly, essentially. He sold that company to Hewlett-Packard back in 2011.
For billions of dollars.
Yeah, it was about, I think, 16 billion.
Lots and lots of money.
Yeah.
The deal turned sour after he was accused of forging the software's financial records to make the sale. He's been fighting that in court for 10 years. This yacht trip was said to be a celebration of his acquittal.
Because the acquittal only happened in June. So, it's just a few weeks afterwards. And it was, as you say, a very long legal battle there. It's still unclear what happened to the yacht, though, except that it looks like it's been hit by this sort of freak storm. Talks about a water spout or a water tornado, something like that. The manufacturer of the yacht, though, says that it looks like human error, that the crew didn't secure things properly.
On top of this, a coincidence. Just hours after the news of the yacht, a man called Stephen Chamberlain died in hospital after being hit by a car while out running. He was Lynch's former co-defendant in a US fraud trial in which they were both acquitted. We're not suggesting anything, but this is the reason many people are finding this story very intriguing. At The Squiz, we're interested in growing podcast listening in general because the more people listening to podcasts, the better for us, which is why we're working with Mamamia over the next little while to highlight some of their podcasts. And they're going to do the same for us. To that end, if you haven't already come across it, we might point you to No Filter. It's Mia Friedman's interview show where she unearths some riveting stories you've never heard before. People open up to her in the most surprising ways. Search for No Filter wherever you get your podcasts. Claire, you and Bryce spoke last week about the NT election. That's happening today. Labor is seeking a third term. Could be tight though.
The indulgence that I would want to speculate around all of that and have a long conversation, I am being very disciplined. Let's see what happens.
Yep. As we head into next week, PIF is on.
PIF is on, the Pacific Islands Forum. That's in Tonga. As it says on the tin, it's the meeting of the Pacific Island nation leaders. Anthony Albanese set to attend.
Our Prime Minister mostly goes to that. I can't think of many times that they haven't.
Particularly in recent years, it's been a real focus for the Prime Minister to go and do that. Of course, we've talked a lot about China and the Solomons and engagement. Scott Morrison had a lot of criticism about not doing enough there. Anthony Albanese has attended and showed up to a lot of those things.
Yeah, also coming up is the Paralympics. The opening ceremony is on Thursday morning. Like the Olympics, in case you're wondering, it's not in a stadium. It's taking place at the Place de la Concorde and the Champs-Élysées. Claire, 4,400 athletes. It's bigger than I sort of thought.
It's a lot.
160 are Australian, will compete in 17 of the 22 sports.
So if you turn it on, you're bound to see an Aussie. It's really great.
An Australian. It's all on 9, of course, as the Olympics was, and no doubt this time next week we'll have some stories to tell. What else?
Last week of winter.
That's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
Squiz recommends this week, Claire. I'm actually going to recommend our shortcut because you and I talked 2 weeks ago about the NASA astronauts who were stuck at the International Space Station.
Because it was one of those, there was just this sort of deluge of crazy news during the Olympics, and this was absolutely one of those stories. So it captured Siobhan and Alice and Larissa Huntington's attention, and they've done a shortcut on it. We don't plug shortcuts much, but it's a great listen.
Oh, it's so good because it answers all the questions you might have about, like, what are they going to do? They're stuck there for months and months and months. How are they going to get down? What went wrong? Also a little bit, I didn't realise a lot about the space station and what's actually there.
Yep.
They described it like a 6-bedroom home. It's got a gym. They have to, so many great facts. So I highly recommend listening to that shortcut this week. We'll put a link to it in your episode notes, or else it's over at the Squiz Today show. Claire, you have another podcast to recommend.
I do.
Not one of ours.
Not one of ours, but you and I, in the nerdy end of podcasting, we subscribe to a thing called Pod News.
Oh, yes.
And it gives all of the insights from overseas about what's happening, particularly in the United States. And one that it keeps bumping to the list as a bit of a news item, because there's a lot of chatter around it in the US, is a podcast called Noble. Very true crime. I started listening to it this week. I'm absolutely addicted. It's only short episodes. They're only 27, 35 sort of minutes long. It's this wild story about a crematorium in the tiny little township called Noble in Georgia, which you said you might have driven through.
I feel like I don't know. I drove around there a lot.
Coincidence, yeah. Lots of bodies essentially that weren't dealt with in the correct way. So it's a real exploration about what we owe the dead and how we deal with people who have passed. It's not for people who are a bit squirmish around death or depictions or descriptions of
That's
dead people and decay and all of that sort of thing. I'm really enjoying it.
Okay.
Audio storytelling, it's a whole thing, and it's beautiful. It's beautifully put together. I'm really enjoying it.
Squiz Press, I was actually going to recommend a show called The Assembly, which is on ABC at the moment. It's hosted by Lee Sales, and the reason I was going to recommend it is because I really enjoyed it, first and foremost, but also Lee Sales is coming in to be interviewed by us on Monday morning.
Or by you.
By me. I'm a bit scared.
Isn't that not? So that's Monday?
That's Monday. The episode will be out on Wednesday. It's part of our Newsmaker series, obviously.
I was just going to say it's going to be a nice relaxing weekend for you, isn't it? On Sunday night when you're going to bed.
Just interviewing the best interviewer in the country.
I know.
It's so it's so lovely that she said yes. She wants to talk about that show. That show is all about autistic journalism students interviewing some of our biggest names. So Sam Neill was the first episode. Hamish Blake is another one coming up. I think Delta Goodrem. I think Anthony Albanese's doing it. It's such a warm show.
And Lee will have some wonderful insights and perspectives about news as well. So really looking forward to that. No pressure, Kate.
No pressure. Really looking forward. I'm so thrilled she said yes, and we can't wait to have her in here. And as I said, that episode will be out on Wednesday morning for you to have a listen to. Thanks for listening to this episode of Weekly Wrap. We'll be back next week.